By the time this 10th treatise begins, the structure has already been built. What appears is not self-sufficient. What changes depends on what does not. Perception engages with form. Thought determines how that form is understood. Ignorance is the failure to hold that relationship. And transformation replaces the idea of loss. All of this has been established. What has not yet been fully resolved is the source of it. Because throughout everything that has been described, one principle has remained present: mind. Not as thought in the ordinary sense, not as the process of reasoning or analyzing what is perceived, but as the condition that makes perception and thought possible in the first place. This is where the text returns. The key, not as something new, but as something that has already been present in everything that has been said. Because without mind, nothing that has been described could occur. There would be no perception, no thought, no distinction between what appears and what underlies it, no recognition, no ignorance. Nothing would be structured in the way that it has been outlined. This is why mind cannot be treated as one part of the system. It is not something that operates within reality. It is what allows reality to be known at all. This is where the earlier distinctions begin to converge. Perception depends on mind. Thought depends on mind. Recognition depends on mind. Even the failure to recognize depends on mind. This places it in a different position, not within the structure, but as the condition that allows the structure to exist. This is why the text calls it the key, because without recognizing this, everything else remains partial. The structure can be understood. The relationships can be described. But the source of those relationships remains unexamined. And when the source is not recognized, the structure cannot be held with full precision. This is where the shift occurs, not towards something additional, but toward what has always been present. Mind is not something that appears. It is not something that can be perceived in the same way as form. It is recognized through what it allows, through the fact that perception occurs, through the fact that thought operates, through the fact that understanding is possible. This is why it is often overlooked, because it does not present itself as an object. It does not draw attention in the same way as what appears. And because of this, it is easy to treat it as though it were one function among many. The text does not allow this. It places mind at the level of what underlies everything that has been described, not as a concept, but as the condition that makes all concepts possible. This is where the entire structure begins to tighten, because once mind is recognized in this way, everything that has been established must be understood in relation to it. Perception is no longer just engagement with form. It is engagement made possible by mind. Thought is no longer just interpretation. It is interpretation grounded in mind. Alignment is no longer just correct positioning. It is positioning in relation to mind. This changes the scale of everything, because what was previously described as structure is now understood as dependent on something more fundamental. And that is where this chapter begins, not by expanding the system, but by returning to its source. From this point, the text will begin to clarify how mind relates to what appears, and why recognizing this relationship is essential for holding everything that has already been established. Because without it, the structure remains incomplete. And with it, everything becomes precise. And that is where the treatise continues. Once mind has been identified as central, the next step is to understand its position with precision. Because if it is treated as one function among others, the entire structure becomes distorted again. Mind is not a product of what appears. It does not arise from form. It is not generated by processes within the field of becoming. It is not something that develops out of what is perceived. This must be held clearly. Because the tendency is to treat mind as something that belongs to the individual, something that operates within the body, something that depends on conditions. The text does not support this. It places mind at the level of condition, not expression. This means that mind does not depend on what appears. What appears depends on mind. This is a reversal that changes everything. Because if mind is treated as something that emerges from what is perceived, then perception becomes foundational. The structure collapses back into sense. Thought becomes an extension of perception, and everything that has been established begins to lose its precision. But if mind is understood as the condition that allows perception and thought to occur, then its position becomes clear. It does not belong to the system. It allows the system to exist. This is why it cannot be perceived in the same way as form. It does not appear. It is recognized through its function. Through the fact that perception is possible. Through the fact that thought operates. Through the fact that understanding occurs. Without mind, none of this could take place. This is what defines it as condition. Not something that can be added or removed, but something that must already be present for anything else to occur. This also removes the idea that mind is limited to the individual. Because if it were, then the structure would be fragmented. Each instance of perception would depend on a separate source. Each instance of thought would operate independently. There would be no continuity, no shared structure. The text does not describe this. It maintains that mind is singular at the level of condition, not divided, not distributed. What appears as individual thought is an expression within that condition, not the source of it. This distinction is essential, because without it, mind is reduced to something that belongs to form. It becomes another element within the system. And once that happens, it is treated as dependent. This removes its role as the key. Because what depends on the system cannot explain the system. This is why mind must be held at the level of what does not change. It is not part of transformation. It allows transformation. It is not part of variation. It allows variation. This places it alongside what has already been described as foundational. What does not change. What underlies what appears. What allows everything to be. This is where the earlier ideas converge again. Good, as defined previously, belongs to what does not change. Existence, at its most fundamental level, belongs to what does not come into being. Mind, in this chapter, is placed at that same level. Not as something separate, but as something that must be understood in relation to what has already been established. This does not create a new structure. It clarifies the existing one. Everything that appears depends on what does not change. Everything that is understood depends on mind. These are not separate ideas. They are expressions of the same relationship. This is what the text begins to make explicit. Not by adding complexity, but by reducing everything to its source. From this point, the treatise moves toward how mind relates to what appears without becoming part of it, and how this relationship must be understood if the structure is to remain intact. Because once mind is recognized as condition, its relationship to form must be held without confusion. And that is where the text continues. Once mind has been established as condition, the next question is how it relates to what appears without being reduced to it. Because this is where confusion usually returns. If mind allows perception and thought to occur, it can be mistaken as something that exists within what is perceived. It can be treated as though it operates alongside form, as though it were another element within the field of becoming. The text does not allow this. Mind is not part of appearance. It does not take form. It does not come into being. And because of this, it cannot be located within what appears. This does not mean that it is separate in the sense of being elsewhere. It means that it is not reducible to any instance of what appears. This distinction must be held carefully, because if mind is treated as something within appearance, it becomes subject to the same conditions as form. It becomes variable. It becomes dependent. And once that happens, it can no longer function as condition. This is why the relationship must be precise. Mind allows appearance. Appearance does not contain mind. This is not a spatial distinction. It is structural. What appears is always changing. It takes shape. It dissolves. It reconfigures. Mind does not participate in this process. It does not move with it. It does not shift from one state to another. It remains what it is. This is what allows change to occur without affecting what underlies it. This also explains why mind cannot be perceived. Perception operates within the field of appearance. It engages with form. It identifies variation. It recognizes difference. Mind does not present itself in this way. It does not appear as something that can be distinguished from other things. It does not become an object within perception. This is why it is often overlooked, not because it is absent, but because it does not appear, and perception is oriented toward what appears. This creates a tendency to treat what is not perceived as though it were not present. This is the same structure that has been identified throughout the earlier chapters. What is visible is treated as real. What is not visible is excluded. When this is applied to mind, it is either ignored or reduced to something that can be perceived. Both of these positions distort its role. Mind is not absent, and it is not an object. It is the condition that allows objects to be known. This is where the earlier distinction between thought and sense becomes relevant again. Sense engages with what appears. Thought determines how what appears is understood. Mind allows both. Without mind, there would be no perception, no thought, no recognition of what appears. This places it at a level that cannot be reduced to either. It is not sense. It is not thought. It allows both to occur. This is what defines its relationship to appearance, not as something within it, but as something that makes it possible. This relationship must be maintained, because if it is lost, mind is either treated as part of appearance or excluded from the structure entirely. In both cases, the system collapses. What underlies everything is either reduced to something within it or removed from consideration. This returns the structure to the earlier condition of misalignment. This is why the text is precise here. Mind must be recognized as present in everything that appears, without being any of it. It must be understood as constant while everything else changes. This is not a contradiction. It is the same structure that has been described throughout. What does not change allows what changes. What does not appear allows what appears. Mind allows both perception and thought. This is where the entire system begins to converge again. From this point, the text moves toward how this recognition affects the way understanding itself is held, and how the relationship between mind and what appears must be maintained within experience. Because once mind is recognized as condition, the only remaining task is to hold that recognition without distortion. And that is where the treatise continues. Once mind is recognized as condition rather than expression, the question shifts toward how knowing itself operates. Because if mind is what allows perception and thought, then it must also determine how anything is truly known. This is where a distinction must be made. There is a difference between recognizing what appears and knowing what is. Recognition at the level of sense is immediate. It identifies form. It distinguishes one thing from another. It allows for interaction with what is present. This is necessary, but it does not extend beyond appearance. It does not account for what allows appearance to occur. This is why it cannot be the basis for knowing what is. Knowing, in the sense the text is describing, does not arise from accumulation. It is not the result of gathering information about what appears, because information, as it is commonly understood, is derived from perception. It describes variation. It tracks change. It organizes what is visible, but it does not reach what does not appear. This is where knowing must be redefined. Knowing is not built from sense. It is grounded in mind. This does not mean that information becomes irrelevant. It means that information cannot define what is. It can describe how things appear. It can explain relationships within the field of becoming, but it cannot reach the condition that allows that field to exist. This is why knowing cannot be reduced to what is perceived. It must involve recognition of what does not appear. This recognition does not occur through sense. It occurs through mind, not as a process, but as clarity. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that what does not appear is not therefore absent. Clarity that understanding depends on holding both within the same structure. This is what defines knowing at this level. It is not the addition of content. It is the correct positioning of what is already present. What is perceived remains. What is understood remains. But both are now held in relation to what allows them to occur. This removes distortion, not by changing what is known, but by changing how it is held. This also explains why knowledge can exist without understanding. A system can contain a large amount of information. It can describe complex relationships. It can produce accurate results within its domain, and still not recognize what underlies it. In this case, knowledge remains at the level of sense. It does not become knowing, because it is not grounded in mind. This is the distinction the text is making, not between knowing and not knowing, but between different levels of knowing. One that is derived from perception, and one that is grounded in what allows perception. This distinction must be held carefully, because without it, the accumulation of information can be mistaken for understanding. And when that happens, the structure returns to its earlier condition. What appears becomes sufficient. What underlies it becomes excluded. This is why knowing through mind is not optional. It is necessary for maintaining the structure that has been established. From this point, the text moves toward how this form of knowing is maintained within experience, and how the recognition of mind must remain active if understanding is to remain intact. Because once knowing is grounded in mind, the only remaining task is to prevent it from being reduced again to what is perceived. And that is where the treatise continues. Once knowing has been grounded in mind, the structure becomes clear. What appears is no longer treated as self-sufficient. What is understood is no longer limited to what is perceived. The relationship between appearance and condition has been restored. What remains is how this position is held. Because, as with everything that has been established, alignment is not fixed. It must be maintained. This is not because mind changes. It does not. What changes is the position of thought in relation to it. Thought can remain oriented toward mind, or it can return to serving sense. When it returns to sense, the structure begins to narrow. What appears becomes more immediate. What underlies it becomes less present within understanding. The relationship between them becomes less clear. This is how misalignment develops. not suddenly, gradually, without interruption. This is why remaining in mind is not a state that is reached and then secured. It is a condition that must remain active, not through effort in the conventional sense, but through clarity. Clarity that what appears is not complete. Clarity that what does not appear is not therefore absent. Clarity that understanding depends on remaining oriented toward what does not change. This clarity must remain continuous, because the conditions that produce misalignment remain active. Perception continues to operate. It continues to present what appears as though it were complete. Attention continues to move toward what is immediate. What changes continues to draw focus. Without the continued recognition of mind, thought begins to shift. It becomes anchored again in perception. It begins to organize what appears without reference to what underlies it. This is how the earlier structure returns, not through contradiction, but through omission. Mind is no longer included in the structure of understanding. What remains is a system that appears coherent, but is no longer grounded. This is why remaining in mind is not an additional step. It is the continuation of the structure itself. Without it, everything that has been established begins to lose its precision. The distinction between thought and sense becomes less clear. The recognition of what underlies appearance fades. What is perceived becomes sufficient again. This is the movement that must be prevented, not by resisting perception, but by maintaining its correct position. Perception must remain active. It must continue to engage with what appears, but it cannot define what is. It must be held in relation to mind. This relationship must remain present at all times, not intermittently, not only when attention is directed toward it, but continuously, because the tendency to return to perception as foundation is continuous. This is why the text does not describe remaining in mind as a process. It describes it as a condition in which thought does not drift, in which perception does not become sufficient, in which what underlies everything remains recognized. This is what allows the structure to remain intact. From this point, the text moves toward its final movement, not to introduce something new, but to restate everything in its most reduced and stable form now that mind has been recognized as the key. Because once the source has been identified, the only thing that remains is to hold that recognition without distortion. And that is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this 10th treatise, the structure that has been built across the previous chapters is no longer held only in terms of relationships between what appears and what underlies it. It has been brought back to its source, mind, not as a concept, not as a function within the system, but as the condition that allows the system to exist. This is what defines it as the key. Everything that has been established depends on it. Perception depends on mind. Thought depends on mind. Recognition depends on mind. Even ignorance depends on mind. Without it, there would be no structure to describe. This is why it cannot be treated as one element among others. It does not belong to the system. It allows the system to be. This places it at the same level as what has already been defined as constant. What does not change? What does not come into being? What underlies everything that appears? This is where the earlier distinctions converge again. Good, as defined previously, belongs to what does not change. Existence, at its most fundamental level, belongs to what does not come into being. Mind, in this chapter, is recognized as the condition through which all of this is known, not separate from what has been described, but essential to it. This does not expand the structure. It reduces it. Everything that has been outlined returns to this point. What appears depends on what does not. What is understood depends on mind. These are not separate relationships. They are expressions of the same structure. This is what the text has been moving toward. Not complexity, but precision. Because once mind is recognized as condition, everything else must be understood in relation to it. Perception is no longer sufficient. Thought must not be grounded in sense alone. Knowing must not be reduced to information. All of these have already been established. What this chapter does is show why. Because without mind, none of them could occur. This is what gives the structure its coherence. Not the relationships themselves, but what allows those relationships to be recognized. This is why the text does not end with an additional idea. It ends with a condition. A condition in which mind has been recognized as the source, the structure has been clarified in relation to it, and the only remaining task is to hold that recognition without distortion. This must be maintained. Because the tendency to reduce mind to something within appearance remains active. Perception continues to present what appears as though it were complete. Thought continues to move toward what is immediate. Without the continued recognition of mind, the structure begins to collapse again. Not because it changes, but because it is no longer held. This is why the text returns to simplicity. Not as reduction, but as clarity. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that what does not appear is not therefore absent. Clarity that everything that is known depends on mind. This clarity must remain, because once it is lost, everything that has been established becomes partial again. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues. Not by introducing a new structure, but by approaching the same structure from new angles, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once mind has been recognized as the key, the task is no longer to define it. It is to remain in relation to it. And that is the only way the structure remains intact. By the time this 11th treatise begins, the structure has already been brought back to its source. Mind has been recognized as the condition that allows everything to be known. What appears depends on what does not. What is understood depends on mind. The relationships are clear. What changes here is not the structure. It is the position from which it is expressed. Up to this point, the text has described mind. It has been explained in relation to perception, thought, and understanding. In this chapter, that distance is removed. Mind is no longer described. It speaks, not as a voice in the ordinary sense, not as something that appears within perception, but as the direct expression of what has already been established. This is where interpretation becomes more difficult, because what is being presented is not something that can be analyzed in the same way as earlier distinctions. It is not building the structure. It is expressing it from within itself. This requires a different kind of attention, not one that breaks things apart, but one that holds them as they are. Because what is being said here does not introduce something new. It makes explicit what has already been present. Mind does not need to be constructed. It does not need to be reached. It is already the condition through which everything is occurring. This is what the chapter begins to make direct. Not by adding complexity, but by removing distance. This is why the tone shifts. There is less explanation, less separation between what is being described and what is describing it. The structure is no longer being built. It is being spoken from. This is where the earlier ideas must already be held, because without them, what is said here can be misunderstood. It can be reduced to something within perception. It can be treated as though it were another layer of thought. The text does not allow this. It maintains that what is being expressed here is not something that appears. It is what allows appearance. This is why the distinction between thought and mind must remain clear. Thought interprets. Mind allows interpretation. Thought operates within the structure. Mind allows the structure to exist. This is what must be held as the chapter begins. Because what follows is not a continuation of explanation. It is the expression of what has already been established, now without distance. From this point, the text begins to speak directly. And what is being spoken cannot be approached in the same way as what has come before, because here the structure is no longer being described. It is being expressed, and that is where the treatise continues. Once the distance is removed, what follows cannot be approached in the same way as earlier chapters. This is not explanation. It is expression. Mind does not describe itself through analysis. It does not build an argument. It does not organize ideas into a system. It speaks from what is already present. This is what must be understood first. Because if this is treated as another layer of thought, it will be reduced again to something within perception. It will be interpreted, analyzed, and placed within the same structure that it is meant to reveal. This is not its position. Mind is not speaking as an object. It is not something that can be observed. It is the condition that allows observation. This changes how what is said must be held. It cannot be approached as information. It must be recognized as what allows information to be understood. This is where the distinction becomes precise. Thought takes what is given and organizes it. Mind allows anything to be given at all. Thought moves through what appears. Mind allows appearance. This is not something that can be demonstrated through examples, because every example would already depend on mind to be recognized. This is why what is being expressed here does not rely on proof. It relies on recognition. Recognition that what is being pointed to is already present, not somewhere else, not beyond experience, but as the condition of experience itself. This is what gives the voice of mind its quality. It does not attempt to convince. It does not attempt to explain. It states, not in the sense of making claims, but in the sense of revealing what is already the case. This is why it can feel direct. There is no distance between what is being expressed and what is expressing it. There is no separation between subject and object, because mind is not within that structure. It allows that structure to exist. This is where confusion can return if the earlier distinctions are not held, because it is easy to treat this as though it was something being said by something, as though mind was speaking in the same way a person speaks. The text does not support this. It maintains that what is being expressed is not separate from what is being expressed through. This removes the usual framework of communication. There is no sender and receiver in the ordinary sense. There is only recognition. This is why the chapter must be approached differently, not by trying to interpret each part as a statement about something external, but by recognizing that what is being expressed is already the condition through which recognition is possible. This is what defines the voice of mind. Not something that appears, not something that can be located, but something that must already be present for anything to be known at all. From this point, the text moves toward how this expression relates to what appears and how the relationship between mind and form must be held without confusion. Because once mind is recognized in this way, the distinction between what speaks and what is spoken must remain clear. And that is where the treatise continues. Once mind is no longer treated as something within the structure of appearance, the idea of separation begins to shift. Because separation depends on form. It depends on distinction between one thing and another. It depends on boundaries that can be recognized through perception. This is how sense operates. It identifies difference. It distinguishes objects. It separates what appears into parts. This is necessary within the field of becoming. Without it, there would be no way to navigate what appears. But this separation does not extend to mind, because mind is not part of what appears. It does not take form. It does not exist as one thing among others. And because of this, it cannot be divided in the same way. This is what must be understood. There is no separation in mind. Not because everything is the same at the level of form, but because mind is not structured by form. It does not operate through distinction. It allows distinction to occur. This changes how the relationship between what appears and what underlies it must be held. At the level of appearance, separation is real. Forms are distinct. They can be identified. They can be related to one another. This remains valid. But at the level of mind, this distinction does not apply. Because mind is not divided by the forms that appear within it. This is where confusion often arises, because the absence of separation at the level of mind can be mistaken for the absence of distinction at the level of form. The text does not support this. It maintains both. Distinction exists within appearance. Unity exists at the level of mind. These are not in conflict. They are different levels of the same structure. If this is not held carefully, the structure collapses. Either everything is reduced to distinction and the underlying unity is lost, or everything is reduced to unity and the distinctions within appearance are ignored. Both positions distort what has been established. The text maintains that separation is real where it applies, and absent where it does not. This requires precision, because perception continues to operate. It continues to present a world of distinct forms, and this presentation is convincing. It appears complete. It appears self-sufficient, but it does not extend to mind. This is where recognition must remain active, not to deny distinction, but to prevent it from being treated as absolute. Forms are distinct. Mind is not divided. What appears is multiple. What underlies it is not. This is what must be held, because without this, the earlier structure begins to shift again. What appears becomes foundational. Distinction becomes absolute, and the underlying condition is no longer recognized. This is the same movement that has been described throughout the earlier chapters. Only here it is applied more precisely, because the relationship between unity and distinction is now being held directly. This is what defines this section. Not the removal of difference, but the recognition that difference does not extend to what allows difference to appear. From this point, the text moves toward how this absence of separation relates to knowing itself, and how understanding must be held when what underlies everything cannot be divided. Because once separation is no longer applied to mind, the structure of knowing must also be understood differently. And that is where the treatise continues. Once separation is no longer applied to mind, the way knowing itself is understood must also change. Because ordinary knowing depends on division. It separates the knower from what is known. It distinguishes subject from object. It places what is perceived outside of the one who perceives it. This is how knowledge is usually structured. Something is observed. It is analyzed. It is understood as something distinct from the one observing it. This works at the level of sense. It allows for interaction with what appears. It creates a framework in which information can be gathered, compared, and organized. But this structure does not extend to mind, because mind is not divided. It is not separate from what is known. It allows both the knower and the known to appear. This changes the nature of knowing. Knowing at this level is not the movement between two separate points. It is not the transfer of information from one thing to another. It is recognition within what is already present. There is no distance to cross, no separation to bridge, because the distinction between knower and known does not apply at this level. This is what makes it difficult to approach through ordinary thought. Thought operates through distinction. It separates. It compares. It builds relationships between what it identifies as separate. When applied here, it attempts to treat mind as though it was something that could be known in the same way as objects. But this does not hold, because mind is not an object. It is what allows objects to be known. This is why knowing through mind cannot be reduced to analysis. It does not involve breaking something apart. It involves recognizing what is already the case. This recognition is immediate, not in the sense of being quick, but in the sense of not requiring a process. It does not unfold over time. It is not constructed. It is present. This is where the earlier distinction between knowledge and knowing becomes precise again. Knowledge, as it is commonly understood, accumulates. It builds. It develops over time. Knowing in this context does not. It does not increase or decrease. It does not depend on conditions. It is either recognized or it is not. This is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of position. If thought remains aligned with sense, knowing is reduced to knowledge. It becomes something that is built from perception. If thought remains aligned with mind, knowing is grounded in what allows perception. This removes division, not at the level of form, but at the level of what underlies form. Forms remain distinct. They can still be identified. They can still be related, but they are no longer treated as separate in the absolute sense, because what allows them to appear is not divided. This is what must be held, not as an idea, but as clarity within experience. Clarity that what is known is not separate from what allows it to be known. Clarity that the structure of knowing does not depend on separation at this level. This does not remove the use of distinction within thought. It repositions it. Distinction remains within appearance. It does not define what underlies appearance. This is what allows the structure to remain intact. From this point, the text moves toward how this form of knowing is maintained and how the recognition of mind must remain present if this absence of division is not to be reduced again to ordinary understanding. Because once knowing is no longer divided, the only thing that remains is to hold that position without returning to separation. And that is where the treatise continues. Once knowing is no longer structured through division, the question shifts again. It is no longer about how something is understood, but how that position is maintained. Because, as with everything that has been established, this is not fixed. It can be held, and it can be lost. Not because what underlies reality changes, but because thought can return to its earlier position. It can begin to operate again through distinction alone. This is the movement that must be understood. At the level of appearance, distinction remains active. Forms continue to be separate. They can be identified, compared, and related. This does not stop. It does not need to be removed. The problem arises when this distinction is extended beyond where it applies, when the separation that exists within appearance is treated as absolute, when it is applied to what underlies appearance. This is where division returns, not as something that actually exists at the level of mind, but as something that is imposed through thought. Thought begins to separate what is not separate. It begins to treat what is known as though it were outside of what allows it to be known. This is how the earlier structure reasserts itself. The knower and the known become divided again. Understanding becomes something that moves between them. What was previously recognized as immediate becomes mediated. This shift is subtle, because it does not remove clarity all at once. It introduces distance, a slight separation, a sense that what is known must be reached, must be understood through process. This is how division stabilizes, not as confusion, but as a return to familiar structure. This is why remaining without division requires recognition. Recognition of when thought begins to reintroduce separation. Recognition of when what is known is being treated as though it were outside of what allows it to be known. Recognition of when understanding begins to move away from immediacy and back into process. This recognition must remain active, because the tendency toward division is continuous. Thought operates through distinction. It is its nature. And because of this, it will continue to move toward separation unless it is held in relation to what does not divide. This is why the earlier structure must remain present. Mind does not divide. It allows division to appear. This distinction must be maintained, not as an idea, but as clarity within experience. Clarity that separation belongs to appearance. Clarity that what underlies appearance is not divided. Clarity that knowing at this level does not depend on the movement between separate points. This clarity does not remove thought. It repositions it. Thought continues to operate. It continues to distinguish. But it does not extend that distinction to what does not divide. This is what allows the structure to remain intact. From this point, the text moves toward its final movement. Not to introduce something new, but to restate everything in its most reduced form, now that mind has been expressed directly and the absence of division has been clarified. Because once separation is no longer applied to what underlies reality, the only thing that remains is to hold that recognition without returning to division. And that is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this 11th treatise, the structure that has been developed across the earlier chapters has shifted again, not in content, but in position. What was previously described is now expressed. Mind is no longer approached as something to be understood from a distance. It has been presented as the condition through which all understanding occurs. This removes the separation between what is being described and what is describing it. There is no longer a gap between subject and object at this level. This does not eliminate distinction within appearance. Forms remain separate. They continue to be recognized, compared, and related. But this separation does not extend to mind. This is the central point that has been held. No division in mind. Not as an abstract claim, but as a structural condition. Because mind does not take form. It does not exist as one thing among others. It allows the existence of things. And because of this, it cannot be divided by what appears within it. This has direct implications for how knowing is understood. Knowing at this level is not structured through separation. It is not the movement from one point to another. It is not the accumulation of information about something external. It is recognition within what is already present. This recognition does not depend on process. It does not unfold through steps. It is immediate, not in the sense of being quick, but in the sense of not requiring mediation. This is what defines knowing through mind. It does not pass through division. It is not constructed through distinction. It is present as the condition of all knowing. This position must be maintained, because the tendency to return to division remains active. Thought continues to operate through distinction. Perception continues to present separate forms. Attention continues to move toward what appears. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, the structure begins to shift. Division is reintroduced. The knower and the known become separate again. Understanding becomes something that must be reached. This is how the earlier structure returns. Not through contradiction, but through gradual reorientation. This is why the text does not end with resolution. It ends with a condition in which the absence of division has been recognized, the role of mind has been clarified, and the only remaining task is to hold that recognition without distortion. This is not something that can be secured once and for all. It must remain active, not through effort, but through clarity. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that separation belongs to form, not to what allows form. Clarity that knowing does not depend on division at this level. This clarity must remain, because once it is lost, everything that has been established becomes partial again. The structure remains, but it is no longer recognized. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues, not by introducing something new, but by returning again and again to what has already been revealed, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once mind has been expressed directly, the task is no longer to understand it. It is to remain without division. And that is the only way the structure remains intact. By the time this 12th treatise begins, mind has already been brought into focus as the condition that allows everything to be known. It has been separated from thought. It has been separated from perception. It has been established as what does not change, what does not divide, and what allows both distinction and understanding to occur. This has been held clearly. What changes here is the scope. Because until this point, mind could still be misunderstood as something that belongs to the individual, as something that operates within a person, as something that is experienced privately. This chapter removes that interpretation. It introduces what is referred to as the common mind, not as something shared between individuals in the ordinary sense, but as something that is not divided in the first place. This is where precision is required again, because if mind is treated as something that belongs to each individual separately, then it becomes multiple. Each person would have their own mind. Each instance of understanding would be isolated, and the structure would fragment. This is not what the text describes. It maintains that mind is singular at the level of condition. What appears as individual thought is not the source. It is an expression. This is what must be understood. There are not many minds. There is mind. And what appears as separate instances of thought are variations within it. This is not an idea about connection. It is a statement about structure. Because if mind is the condition that allows perception and thought, then it cannot be divided by the forms that appear within perception. Forms are multiple. Mind is not. This is what defines it as common, not because it is distributed, but because it is not separate. This changes the way individuality must be understood. Individuality remains at the level of appearance. Forms are distinct. Thoughts appear as though they belong to specific individuals. Experiences are structured in a way that suggests separation. This remains valid within that level, but it does not extend to mind. This is where confusion can arise, because the absence of division at the level of mind can be mistaken for the absence of distinction at the level of form. The text does not support this. It maintains both: distinction within appearance, unity at the level of mind. This is the same structure that has been held throughout. What changes is that it is now being applied more directly to the idea of individuality itself. This is where the chapter begins. Not by removing individuality, but by placing it within a structure that does not divide. From this point, the text will begin to clarify how the common mind relates to what appears as individual, and how this relationship must be understood if the structure is to remain intact. Because once mind is recognized as not divided, the way in which difference is understood must also change. And that is where the treatise continues. Once mind is recognized as common, the next step is to understand how what appears as individual thought fits within that structure. Because this is where the interpretation usually becomes distorted. Thought appears to belong to the individual. It arises within a particular perspective. It is associated with a specific body, a specific experience, a specific position within the field of perception. This creates the sense that thought originates from the individual, that each person produces their own thought. That understanding is generated privately. The text does not support this. It places thought at the level of expression, not as source. This is a precise distinction, because if thought is treated as the source, then mind is reduced to something that belongs to form. It becomes dependent on what appears, and the structure collapses. But if thought is understood as expression, then its position becomes clear. It does not originate independently. It arises within mind. This does not remove its individuality at the level of appearance. Thoughts still appear as distinct. They still vary. They still reflect the conditions through which they are expressed, but they do not define their own source. This is what must be held. The appearance of individuality does not determine the structure of what underlies it. Forms are distinct. Expressions vary. But what allows those expressions is not divided. This is where the relationship between individual and common must be understood carefully. Because it is easy to move in one of two directions. Either everything is reduced to individuality and the common mind is lost, or everything is reduced to unity and the distinctions within appearance are ignored. Both positions distort the structure. The text maintains both without collapsing one into the other. Thought is individual in appearance. Mind is not divided. This is not a contradiction. It is the same relationship that has been described throughout. What changes exists within what does not change. What is multiple exists within what is not divided. This is what allows variation without fragmentation. Because if mind were divided, then each instance of thought would be isolated. There would be no continuity, no shared structure, no possibility of recognizing anything beyond the individual perspective. This is not what is observed. Understanding is possible. Recognition extends beyond immediate perception. This indicates that what allows thought is not confined to the individual. This is what the text is pointing to, not as an abstract idea, but as a structural necessity. Thought cannot be the source of itself. It depends on something that does not vary with each instance. This is why it must be understood as expression, not independent, not self-generating. but arising within what allows it. This changes how individuality is held. Individual thought is no longer treated as isolated. It is understood as variation within a common condition. This does not remove distinction. It removes the idea that distinction is absolute. From this point, the text moves toward how this understanding affects the way knowledge itself is approached, and how the recognition of a common mind changes the interpretation of what is known. Because once thought is no longer treated as the source, the structure of knowing must also shift. And that is where the treatise continues. Once thought is no longer treated as the source, the way knowledge itself is understood must change. Because if thought is expression, then knowledge cannot originate from the individual alone. It must be grounded in what allows thought to occur. This is where the idea of the common mind becomes directly relevant. Knowledge, as it is usually understood, appears to be accumulated. It is gathered through experience. It is shaped by perception. It is developed over time. This creates the sense that knowledge belongs to the individual, that each person builds their own understanding from what they encounter. This is only partially true, because while the content of knowledge is shaped by experience, the ability to recognize, organize, and understand that content depends on something that does not vary with each individual instance. It depends on mind. This is what connects knowledge to the common mind. Not the specific information that is known, but the condition that allows anything to be known at all. This is what must be held clearly. Because without it, knowledge is reduced to something that exists within separate individuals. It becomes fragmented. Each instance of understanding appears isolated, and the possibility of shared recognition becomes difficult to explain. But shared recognition exists. Understanding can extend beyond individual experience. What is known is not confined to what one person perceives directly. This indicates that knowledge is not entirely individual. It depends on a common condition. This is what the text is pointing to. Not that all knowledge is identical, but that the capacity for knowing is not divided. This capacity does not belong to separate individuals. It allows individuals to know. This is a precise distinction. Because if the capacity is not recognized as common, then knowledge appears as something that must be built independently in each case. But if the capacity is common, then knowledge is understood as variation within a shared structure. This does not remove difference. Different perspectives remain. Different experiences produce different expressions. But the ability to recognize what is being known is not separate. This is why knowledge can be communicated. Why something understood by one can be recognized by another. Because what allows recognition is not divided. This is where the structure must be held carefully. Because it is easy to reduce this to the idea that everything is the same. The text does not support that. It maintains variation within appearance, but it also maintains that what allows variation is not divided. This is the relationship between knowledge and the common mind. Knowledge varies. The capacity for knowing does not. This distinction prevents the structure from collapsing into either fragmentation or uniformity. It allows both difference and continuity to exist without contradiction. This is what must be held. Because without it, knowledge is either treated as entirely individual or entirely universal in a way that removes distinction. Both positions distort the structure. The text maintains the relationship between them. From this point, the treatise moves toward how this understanding affects the way individuality itself is held, and how the recognition of a common mind changes the interpretation of difference. Because once knowledge is no longer treated as isolated, the meaning of individuality must also be understood differently. And that is where the treatise continues. Once the relationship between knowledge and the common mind is clear, the question of individuality must be approached again, but from within that structure. Because if mind is not divided, and if thought is expression within that condition, then individuality cannot be understood in the same way as before. At the level of appearance, individuality remains clear. Forms are distinct. Experiences differ. Perspectives vary. Each instance of thought appears to arise from a specific position. This remains valid. It cannot be removed, but it must be placed correctly. Individuality belongs to appearance. It does not define what underlies appearance. This is the distinction that must be held. Because when individuality is treated as foundational, the structure fragments. Each instance of thought is treated as isolated. Each perspective becomes self-contained, and what allows those perspectives to exist is no longer recognized. This creates a system in which everything appears separate at every level. The text does not support this. It maintains that individuality is real within its domain, but not absolute. It exists within the common, not outside of it. This is what allows variation without division. Different forms can exist. Different expressions can arise, but they do not create separate conditions. They exist within the same condition. This is what must be understood, because without it, individuality becomes a boundary, a limit, something that defines the edges of what can be known or understood. But if individuality is understood as expression within the common mind, then it does not limit what is known. It shapes how it appears. This is a precise shift, because it removes the idea that individuality determines reality. Instead, it shows that individuality determines perspective. What is seen varies. What is remains. This is the relationship that must be held, because it allows difference without fragmentation. It allows variation without separation at the level of what underlies it. This also explains why understanding can move beyond individual perspective. Because what allows understanding is not confined to that perspective. It is not owned by the individual. It is expressed through it. This does not remove the role of individuality. It clarifies it. Individuality is the way in which what is known is expressed. It is not the source of what is known. This distinction must remain active, because the tendency is to return to treating individuality as foundational, to assume that what is known is limited to what is experienced individually. When this happens, the common mind is no longer recognized, and the structure collapses back into separation. This is the movement that must be prevented, not by removing individuality, but by placing it correctly within the common, not as something separate from it. This is where the balance must be maintained. Forms are distinct. Mind is not divided. Individuality exists. It does not define the condition that allows it. From this point, the text moves toward how this balance is maintained, and how the recognition of the common mind must remain active if individuality is not to be treated as absolute. Because once individuality is no longer treated as foundational, the only thing that remains is to hold that position without returning to separation. And that is where the treatise continues. Once the common mind has been recognized, the structure becomes clear. What appears as individual is no longer treated as separate at the level of what underlies it. Thought is understood as expression. Knowledge is no longer isolated. The relationship between difference and unity has been restored. What remains is how this is held. Because, as with everything that has been established, this position is not fixed. It must be maintained. Not because the common mind changes. It does not. But because thought can return to its earlier position. It can begin to treat individuality as foundational again. This is the movement that must be understood. At the level of appearance, individuality continues to be present. Forms remain distinct. Perspectives differ. Experiences vary. This does not stop. It does not need to be removed. The problem arises when this distinction is extended beyond where it applies, when individuality is treated as defining what underlies it, when what appears separate is assumed to be separate at every level. This is where the structure begins to fragment, not because it actually divides, but because division is imposed through thought. Thought begins to operate as though each instance of understanding is isolated, as though what is known is confined to the individual, as though there is no common condition that allows recognition. This is how misalignment develops. Not through contradiction, but through reduction. The common mind is no longer included in the structure. What remains is a system of separate perspectives, each appearing complete within itself. This is convincing. Because at the level of appearance, individuality is clear. It functions. It provides a stable framework for interaction, but it is not complete. It does not account for what allows it to exist. This is why holding the common mind requires recognition. Recognition of when individuality begins to be treated as absolute. Recognition of when thought is no longer grounded in what is not divided. Recognition of when understanding is being confined to perspective. This recognition must remain active, because the tendency towards separation is continuous. Perception reinforces it. Experience presents it. Attention moves toward it. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, the structure begins to shift. Individuality becomes the foundation. Difference becomes division. And what is common is no longer recognized. This is what must be prevented, not by removing difference, but by maintaining its correct position. Difference belongs to appearance. The common mind does not divide. This distinction must remain clear, not as an idea, but as clarity within experience. Clarity that what appears separate is not separate at the level of what allows it. Clarity that understanding is not confined to the individual. Clarity that what is common remains present regardless of variation. This clarity must remain continuous, because once it is lost, the structure collapses back into separation. From this point, the text moves toward its final movement, not to introduce something new, but to restate everything in its most reduced and stable form. Because once the common mind has been recognized, the only remaining task is to hold that recognition without returning to division. And that is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this 12th treatise, the structure that has been built across the previous chapters has expanded to include what appears as individual within what is not divided. Mind has been recognized as the condition that allows everything to be known. It has been clarified as not belonging to the individual. It has been established as common, not shared between separate parts, but not divided in the first place. This is the position that must be held, because without it, everything returns to separation. Individuality has not been removed. Forms remain distinct. Experiences vary. Thought appears to arise from specific perspectives. This remains valid at the level of appearance. What has changed is its position. Individuality is no longer treated as foundational. It is understood as expression within what is not divided. This is the central clarification of this chapter. There are not many minds. There is mind. What appears as many are variations within it. This does not remove difference. It places difference correctly. Difference exists within what is not divided. This is what allows variation without fragmentation. This is what allows knowledge to extend beyond individual perspective. This is what allows recognition to occur across difference. Because what allows recognition is not separate. This is where the earlier structures converge again. What appears depends on what does not. Thought is expression, not source. Knowing is grounded in mind. Mind is not divided. All of these have been established. What this chapter does is apply them directly to the idea of individuality. And in doing so, it removes the final position in which separation can remain unexamined. This is why the structure must now be held with precision. Because the tendency to return to treating individuality as absolute remains active. Perception reinforces it. Experience presents it. Attention moves toward it. Without the continued recognition of the common mind, thought begins to shift. Individuality becomes the foundation again. Difference becomes division. And what is not divided is no longer recognized. This is how the structure collapses, not through contradiction, but through omission. This is why the text does not end with resolution. It ends with a condition in which the common mind has been recognized, the relationship between individuality and what underlies it has been clarified, and the only remaining task is to hold that recognition without distortion. This must remain active, not through effort, but through clarity. Clarity that what appears separate is not separate at the level of what allows it. Clarity that individuality does not define the condition through which it appears. Clarity that what is common remains present in all variation. This clarity must remain, because once it is lost, everything that has been established becomes partial again. The structure remains, but it is no longer recognized. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues, not by introducing something new, but by returning again and again to what has already been revealed, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once the common mind has been recognized, the task is no longer to define it. It is to remain within it. And that is the only way the structure remains intact. There's a point where everything you've understood up to now stops being theoretical. Not because the ideas change, but because they start demanding something from you. This is Chapter 13 of the Corpus Hermeticum, on rebirth. If you've been following the series, you already know this builds chapter by chapter. So if you want the full structure, follow the channel and go back through it properly. This isn't designed to be watched once. It's designed to be returned to. Now, this chapter is different. Up to this point, everything has been about structure. What appears, what underlies it, thought, mind, no division, the common mind. All of it has been laid out clearly. This chapter doesn't add to that. It turns it inward, because understanding the structure is one thing, but remaining within it is something else entirely. This is where rebirth comes in, not as something symbolic, not as something that happens over time, but as a shift in position, a complete reorientation. Because if what has been described so far is actually recognized, then the way you are holding reality cannot stay the same. Something has to give. And what gives is not the world. It's how it's being held. This is what the text calls rebirth. not becoming something new, but no longer holding what was false as though it were true. This is where most people stop, because up to now, you can listen, you can understand, you can agree, but this part requires something else. It requires letting go of the position you've been holding without realizing it. And that's where the difficulty is, because what you're letting go of doesn't feel false. It feels like you. This is where the chapter begins. Not with explanation, but with a demand. Not to learn something new, but to stop holding what was never correct to begin with. And that's where the text moves next. Once the idea of rebirth is introduced, it has to be stripped of everything it is usually associated with, because almost every interpretation of it places it in time. Something that happens later, something that is worked toward, something that is achieved after a process. The text does not support this. Rebirth is not something that unfolds. It is a shift, not gradual, not partial, a complete change in position. This is what must be held clearly. Because if rebirth is treated as a process, it becomes something that can be approached through effort, something that can be accumulated, something that can be built over time. But everything established up to this point already removes that possibility. What is true does not come into being. What underlies everything does not change. Mind does not develop. It is already present. So rebirth cannot be the creation of something new. It cannot be becoming something that was not there before. It must be the removal of what was never correct. This is why it feels immediate. Because nothing new is being added. Something is being dropped. This is what defines the shift. Not movement towards something, but release from something. What is released is the position that has been held unconsciously, the identification with what appears, the assumption that perception is sufficient, the belief that thought, as it operates through sense, defines reality. All of this has already been shown to be incomplete. Rebirth is what happens when that is no longer held, not replaced, removed. This is why it is not gradual, because the structure that has been described does not support partial alignment. Either thought is grounded in what appears, or it is aligned with what underlies it. There is no stable middle position. This is where the difficulty arises, because what is being released is not something external. It is the way everything has been held. It is the position that has defined what feels real. This is why rebirth is not experienced as gain. It is experienced as loss. Not loss of what is, but loss of what was assumed to be. This is what makes it difficult to accept. Because what is being removed feels familiar. It feels stable. It feels like the foundation of everything. But it has already been shown to be incomplete. Rebirth is simply the point where that is no longer ignored. This is why it cannot be approached as an idea. It cannot be understood in the same way as the earlier chapters, because it is not describing structure. It is describing a shift in position within that structure. This is where the chapter begins to move more directly. Because once rebirth is understood in this way, the question is no longer what it means. The question becomes what is still being held that prevents it. And that is where the text moves next. Once rebirth is understood as a shift rather than a process, the next question becomes unavoidable. What is still being held that prevents it? Because nothing new needs to be added. What has been described already exists. What underlies everything is already present. Mind is already the condition. So the only thing that can prevent rebirth is what is still being maintained. This is where the text becomes direct. Because what must be left behind is not external. It is not a set of behaviors. It is not a collection of actions. It is not something that can be adjusted gradually. It is the position itself, the identification with what appears, the assumption that what is perceived is sufficient, the belief that thought, when grounded in sense, defines what is real. All of this has already been shown to be incomplete, but being shown is not the same as being released. Because what is being held is not always recognized. It operates as the background, as the default position, as the way everything has always been interpreted. This is why it does not feel like something that can be left behind. It feels like the only position available. This is what makes the shift difficult. Not because it is complex, but because it requires seeing something that has never been questioned. This is what must be left behind. Not the world, not experience, but the way experience is being held. This includes the attachment to perception as final, the reliance on thought that does not move beyond sense, the assumption that individuality defines the structure of reality. All of these positions have already been examined. They have been shown to be partial, but they remain active. They continue to shape understanding. This is what must be released, not through effort, not through gradual change, but through recognition. Recognition that what is being held is not correct, not in the sense of being wrong within its own level, but in the sense of being incomplete. This is what allows it to be dropped, because once it is seen clearly, it no longer holds in the same way. This is what defines the shift. Not force, not replacement, but the inability to continue holding what is no longer seen as sufficient. This is where rebirth begins to take form, not as something that is done, but as something that happens when what was being held can no longer be maintained. From this point, the text moves toward what remains once this position is released, and how the structure that has been described becomes direct rather than conceptual. Because once what was false is no longer held, what remains is not something new. It is what was always there. And that is where the treatise continues. Once what was being held is no longer maintained, the question shifts again. Not toward what is gained, but toward what remains. Because nothing new has been introduced, nothing has been added. The structure that has been described was already present. What changes is that it is no longer being distorted. This is what must be understood. Rebirth does not create a new condition. It reveals what was already there without interference. What remains is what does not change, what underlies everything that appears, what allows perception, what allows thought, what allows knowing. This has already been established. What is different now is not its presence, but its recognition. It is no longer an idea. It is no longer something that is understood conceptually. It is what is directly held. This is where the earlier distinctions begin to collapse into something simpler. The separation between thought and what underlies it is no longer active. Thought no longer moves independently. It is no longer grounded in sense. It no longer treats what appears as sufficient. This does not remove thought, it repositions it. The same applies to perception. What appears continues to appear. Forms remain. Variation remains. Nothing about the world of appearance is removed. This is important, because rebirth is often misunderstood as withdrawal, as moving away from what appears. The text does not support this. What appears is not rejected. It is no longer treated as foundation. This is the difference. What remains is clarity. Not clarity as an idea, but clarity as position. The structure is no longer being misinterpreted. What changes is held as dependent. What does not change is recognized as foundational. This is what remains. There is no need to construct it, no need to maintain it through effort, because it does not depend on conditions. This is why the shift is described as immediate, not because it happens quickly, but because it does not involve process. What is already present is simply no longer obscured. This is what must be held, because there is a tendency to try to recreate what has been described, to turn it into something that can be repeated, something that can be controlled. This returns it to process, which is not where it belongs. What remains does not need to be managed. It needs to not be replaced. This is where the structure stabilizes, not through effort, but through the absence of distortion. From this point, the text moves toward how this position is maintained and why the shift does not remove the possibility of returning to the earlier way of holding things. Because what has been released can still be taken up again. And that is where the treatise continues. Once the shift has occurred, there is a tendency to assume that it will remain. That once something has been seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. That once what was false has been released, it cannot return. The text does not support this, because what underlies everything does not change, but the way it is held can. This is the distinction that must be understood. Rebirth is not a permanent state. It is a position, and that position can shift, not because what is changes, but because thought can return to its earlier alignment. It can begin again to ground itself in sense, to treat what appears as sufficient, to rebuild the same structure that has already been shown to be incomplete. This does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, through familiarity, through habit, through the pull of what is immediate. Perception continues to operate. It continues to present what appears as though it were complete. And because it functions, it is trusted. This is what allows the earlier structure to return. Not through contradiction, but through repetition. The same assumptions begin to reassert themselves. What is seen becomes what is taken as real. What is not seen becomes less immediate. The relationship that was once clear begins to fade. This is why the shift does not hold automatically, not because it is unstable, but because what distorts it remains active. This is where clarity must remain. Not as effort, but as recognition. Recognition of when thought begins to move again towards sense as foundation. Recognition of when what appears is being treated as complete. Recognition of when the structure is narrowing. This recognition is what prevents the return. Not control, not resistance, but seeing clearly what is happening as it happens. This is what allows the position to remain, not by holding onto something, but by not replacing it. This is where the earlier structures must remain present. What appears is not self-sufficient. What changes depends on what does not. Mind is the condition. These are not ideas to return to. They are what prevent the return to misalignment. This is why the text is precise here. It does not describe rebirth as an end. It describes it as a shift that must be recognized continuously. Not because it is fragile, but because what distorts it is persistent. From this point, the text moves toward its conclusion, not to introduce something new, but to restate everything in its most direct form. Because once rebirth has been understood, the only thing that remains is to hold that position without returning to what was left behind. And that is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this 13th treatise, nothing new has been added to the structure. Everything that has been described across the earlier chapters remains exactly as it was. What has changed is the position from which it is held. Rebirth is not the introduction of something new. It is the removal of what was never correct. What appears has not changed. Forms remain. Experience continues. Thought still operates. Perception still presents what is immediate. None of this has been removed. What has been removed is the assumption that any of it is self-sufficient. This is what defines the shift. Not a change in reality, but a change in how reality is held. This is why rebirth cannot be understood as a process. It does not unfold over time. It does not move from one state to another. It is the point at which what was being maintained can no longer be held. What remains is what was always present, what does not change, what underlies everything that appears, what allows perception, thought, and knowing. This has already been established. This chapter does not redefine it. It makes it direct. This is why it does not feel like gain. It feels like loss, because what is being removed was being held as real. It was being treated as foundation. And once that is no longer possible, something familiar disappears. Not in reality, but in interpretation. This is what creates the sense of shift. Not movement towards something, but release from something. This is where the structure must be held clearly. Because the tendency is to try to stabilize this as a state, to treat it as something that can be maintained through effort, something that can be repeated or recreated. This returns it to process, which is not where it belongs. What remains does not need to be maintained. It needs to not be replaced. This is the distinction, because what distorts it remains active. Perception continues. Thought continues. Attention continues to move toward what is immediate. Without recognition, the earlier position can return. This is why the text does not end with resolution. It ends with a condition. A condition in which what has been seen must remain clear, not through effort, but through not returning to what has already been shown to be incomplete. This is what defines rebirth within this structure. Not something that happens once, but something that is recognized whenever what is false is no longer held. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues, not by adding something new, but by returning again and again to what has already been revealed, each time requiring that it is held without distortion, because once rebirth has been understood, the task is no longer to reach it. It is to not replace it. And that is the only way the structure remains intact. There's a point in this series where the structure stops being explained and starts being delivered, not as information, but as something you either recognize or you don't. This is chapter 14 of the Corpus Hermeticum, the secret sermon on the mountain. If you've been following this properly, you already know this isn't random content. It builds. Every chapter locks into the next. So if you want the full structure, follow the channel and go back through it from the beginning. Because this chapter won't land the same without it. Now, what changes here is the tone, not the structure. Everything that's been established still applies. What appears is not self-sufficient. Mind is the condition. There is no division at that level. Rebirth is the removal of what was never correct. All of that remains. But this chapter stops explaining it. It starts delivering it directly. This is where people usually get lost. Because without explanation, there's nothing to hold on to. No step-by-step. No breakdown. Just statements. And those statements don't try to convince you. They don't argue. They don't prove anything. They point. And if you've done the earlier work, you'll recognize exactly what they're pointing to. If you haven't, it will sound abstract. This is why it's called secret. Not because it's hidden, but because it's not accessible through the same way of thinking that created the problem. This is where the shift from understanding to recognition becomes clear. Because you're not being given something new. You're being shown what's already there without explanation. And that's harder to ignore. This is where the chapter begins. Not by building the structure, but by speaking from it. And that's where it moves next. Once the tone shifts, the idea of secrecy has to be understood correctly, because it's easy to misinterpret, to assume this is about hidden knowledge, something withheld, something only available to certain people. The text does not support that. Nothing here is hidden. Nothing is being kept from you. What makes it secret is not access, it's position. Because what's being pointed to cannot be reached through the same structure that's been shown to be incomplete. If thought is still grounded in sense, this won't land. Not because it's complex, but because it doesn't operate at that level. This is what creates the appearance of secrecy, not exclusion. Incompatibility. The same way earlier chapters showed that perception cannot grasp what does not appear. The same applies here. If you're still trying to interpret this as information, it won't resolve. Because it isn't information. It's recognition. This is why explanation is reduced. Because explanation belongs to thought operating through distinction. And what's being pointed to here is not divided. So the more it's explained, the more it's distorted. This is the tension in this chapter. It has to speak, but it cannot rely on the structure that normally makes things understandable. This is why it feels different. Not because the content has changed, but because the method has. You're no longer being guided step by step. You're being placed in front of something directly. And whether it lands depends on whether the earlier structure is already clear. This is what defines the secret. Not something hidden, but something that cannot be held from the wrong position. From this point, the text moves even more directly. Because once explanation is removed, what remains is statement. And those statements don't build, they reveal. Once explanation is reduced, what remains is direct statement. This is where interpretation becomes the problem. Because the immediate response is to try to understand what is being said, to break it down, to translate it into something familiar, but that returns it to the same structure that has already been shown to be incomplete. This is why the statements are direct. They are not designed to be unpacked. They are designed to be recognized. This is a different function entirely, because recognition does not move through steps. It does not build from one idea to another. It either holds or it doesn't. This is where the earlier work matters. If the distinction between thought and sense is clear, this lands differently. If mind has been recognized as condition, this lands differently. If rebirth has been understood as release, this lands differently. Because now there is nothing being added, only pointed to. This removes the space for interpretation, because interpretation requires distance. And what is being presented here removes that distance. There is no gap between what is said and what it refers to. This is why trying to analyze it creates confusion. It reintroduces separation. It turns something immediate into something conceptual. And once that happens, it moves out of reach again. This is why the text remains direct. Not because it's incomplete, but because anything added would distort it. This is where most people step back. Because without interpretation, there's nothing to control, nothing to organize, nothing to manage. And that feels unstable. But that instability is the point. Because what was being relied on is no longer valid. This is where the shift has to hold. Not through effort, but through not returning to interpretation. From this point, the text continues in the same way. Not expanding, not explaining, but remaining direct. And that's where it moves next. Once direct recognition replaces explanation, the experience changes. And this is where it can feel unstable. Because what's been removed is the structure that normally holds everything in place. Interpretation, process, step-by-step understanding. All of that creates stability, even when it's incomplete. Because it gives something to follow, something to build from, something to control. When that's removed, what remains is immediate. And immediacy doesn't provide structure in the same way. It doesn't give you something to do. It doesn't give you something to hold. It just is. This is what creates the sense of instability. Not because something is wrong, but because what was being relied on is no longer there. This is why people move back. They return to interpretation, to explanation, to rebuilding structure, because that feels safer, more manageable, but that also returns everything to the earlier position, where what appears becomes the foundation again. This is the point of tension in this chapter, because what's being presented doesn't allow that. It requires staying where there's nothing to build, nothing to manage, nothing to interpret. This is what makes it difficult, but it's also what makes it clear. Because without the extra structure, there's nothing distorting what's already there. This is where the earlier idea of rebirth connects directly. Because this is what remains when what was false is no longer held. Not something new, but the absence of distortion. This is why it feels different. Not because reality has changed, but because the way it's being held has. From this point, the text moves toward holding this position without returning to the earlier structures, because that's the only way this remains clear. And that's where it continues. Once recognition is direct, the only thing that matters is whether it remains, not as effort, but as position, because the tendency to return to interpretation is still active. Thought continues to move through distinction. Perception continues to present what appears. Nothing about that stops. So the pull to rebuild structure is constant. To explain, to define, to organize. And all of that reintroduces distance. This is what must be seen clearly. Not resisted, seen. Because once it's seen, it doesn't hold in the same way. This is how the position remains. Not through maintaining something, but through not replacing it. This is consistent with everything that's already been established. Nothing new is required. What distorts it is what must not return. This is why the text stays direct, because adding structure would recreate the problem. So it doesn't. It holds the position and leaves everything else to fall away. This is what must remain clear. From this point, the chapter moves to its conclusion, not by adding something new, but by holding everything in its most direct form. And that's where it ends. By the end of this chapter, nothing has been added. No new structure, no new ideas, no new system to follow. Everything that has been established remains exactly the same. What has changed is how it is delivered. There is no longer explanation, no longer distance, no longer something to interpret. What remains is direct. And that is the point. Because once the structure is clear, explanation becomes unnecessary. It becomes distortion. So it's removed. This is what defines this chapter. Not complexity, but reduction. Everything is brought back to what was already present, without anything extra, without anything added. This is why it's called a sermon. Not because it teaches, but because it speaks from the position that has already been established. This is what must be held, not as something to understand, but as something that is already the case. From here, nothing new is required. Only that this is not replaced by what has already been shown to be incomplete. And that's where it ends. There is a point where returning to something is not repetition, but correction. Not because the idea itself was unclear, and not because something new needs to be added, but because the position from which it is being held has not remained stable. This is where most structures fail, not in how they are explained, but in how they are maintained. This is chapter 15 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It does not extend the system. It does not introduce a new principle. Instead, it returns to one of the most fundamental distinctions that has already been established, the relationship between mind and sense. And the reason it returns is not because it needs further explanation, but because it is still being misapplied. If you have been following this series properly, then this distinction is already familiar. You have already seen that what appears is not self-sufficient. You have already seen that sense engages only with what presents itself as form, and that thought, when grounded in sense, remains confined to that field. You have already seen that mind is not part of that process, but the condition that allows it. So before continuing, follow the channel and go back through the earlier chapters if needed, because this one depends entirely on that structure being clear. Without it, this chapter will feel repetitive. With it, the repetition becomes precise. What this chapter addresses is not whether the distinction has been understood, but whether it is being held. Because even after it has been recognized, the tendency is still to return to sense as the foundation. Not deliberately and not in a way that feels like an error, but in a way that feels natural, stable, and convincing. Perception does not stop. It continues to present what appears as immediate, structured, and complete. Thought continues to operate in response to that presentation, organizing, interpreting, and reinforcing what is visible. And without recognition, it grounds itself in that appearance again, treating it as sufficient. This is where everything begins to shift without being noticed, because nothing appears to break. Understanding still functions, systems still operate, explanations still hold together, but the position has changed, and once that happens, everything is being interpreted from within appearance again, rather than in relation to what underlies it. This is what the chapter is correcting, not by expanding the explanation, but by cutting directly into the way it is being lost in real time. Because the problem has never been perception itself. It has never been the world, or what appears within it. The problem is where thought is grounded. And unless that is held with precision, everything that has already been established begins to narrow again, not through contradiction, but through quiet return to what feels immediate. This is where the chapter begins. Not by building the structure again, but by exposing exactly where it is slipping. And that is what has to be seen. Once something has been seen clearly, there is an immediate assumption that it will remain clear. That understanding, once established, carries itself forward. That recognition creates stability on its own. This assumption is rarely questioned because it feels intuitive. If something is understood, then it is known. And if it is known, then it should not need to be revisited. The text does not support this, because understanding is not the same as holding position. What has been established across the earlier chapters is structurally simple, but simplicity does not guarantee stability. What appears is not self-sufficient. Thought must not be grounded in sense. Mind is the condition that allows both perception and thought. These are not complex conclusions, and they do not require development or refinement. But they do require continuity. Because the conditions that produce misalignment do not stop once something has been understood. Perception continues without interruption. It continues to present what appears as immediate, structured, and complete. Thought continues to respond to that presentation, organizing it, interpreting it, and reinforcing its apparent coherence. Attention continues to move toward what is visible, what is tangible, what is immediate. This creates a constant re-entry point into the same structure that has already been shown to be incomplete. And this re-entry does not feel like a mistake. That is what makes it difficult to recognize. It feels like normal cognition. It feels like clarity. It feels like the same process that allowed understanding to arise in the first place. But what has shifted is not the ability to understand, it is the position from which understanding is operating. When thought aligns again with sense, everything narrows without appearing to do so. What appears begins to take on the role of foundation again. What is visible becomes what is treated as real. What is not visible becomes less immediate, less relevant, and eventually excluded from the structure of understanding. This does not happen through rejection, it happens through omission. And because omission does not disrupt functionality, it is rarely noticed. The system still works, thought still operates. Explanations still hold together. But they are operating within a closed boundary. And that boundary is not recognized as a boundary. This is why the same error does not resolve. Not because it has not been explained, but because it is being reintroduced continuously through the way perception and thought interact. Each time thought grounds itself in what appears without recognizing what underlies it, the same structure forms again. This is not a failure of knowledge. It is not a lack of understanding. It is a failure of position. And unless that position is recognized as it shifts, the return to sense as foundation becomes complete again, and the entire structure collapses back into appearance without ever appearing to do so. This is what the chapter is addressing. Not the idea, but the movement. Sense does not present itself as partial. This is what makes it so convincing, and this is what makes it so difficult to question. It does not indicate that something is missing. It does not reveal its own limitation. Within its own domain, it appears complete. What is perceived is structured. Forms are distinct. Relationships between forms can be identified and understood. Patterns emerge, and those patterns can be used to predict, to explain, and to organize experience. Everything within that field operates with a level of consistency that reinforces trust. This is not accidental. It is the nature of sense. Sense engages with what appears. It provides access to variation, to difference, to form. It allows navigation within the field of becoming. And because it performs this function effectively, it creates the impression that nothing lies beyond it. This is where the limitation becomes invisible. Because nothing within the field of sense suggests that it is incomplete. There is no internal contradiction. There is no failure that points beyond itself. Everything that appears can be accounted for within its own structure. But what it cannot account for is what allows it to function at all. It does not reach what does not appear. It does not engage with what does not change. It does not recognize the condition that allows appearance to occur. And because that condition does not present itself as form, it is not included in the structure of perception. This is not a flaw, it is a boundary. But that boundary is not perceived as a boundary. It is experienced as the whole. This is where distortion begins. Not because something incorrect is introduced, but because something essential is excluded without being recognized as excluded. What is missing is not visible, so it is not considered. And because it is not considered, it is not included in the structure of understanding. When thought aligns with sense, it inherits this limitation. Everything it produces remains within the field of appearance. It organizes, refines, and explains what is perceived, but it does not extend beyond it. It does not reach what underlies it. This creates a form of clarity that feels complete, but is structurally limited. This is what must be seen clearly. Not that sense is unreliable, but that it is insufficient as foundation. It provides content, but it does not provide condition. It presents form, but it does not account for what allows form to appear. And unless this is recognized, thought continues to treat what appears as though it was self-sufficient. This is the point at which the structure closes in on itself, not through error, but through completeness that is only apparent. The correction does not require the introduction of anything new. It does not involve altering perception, changing the world, or stepping away from what appears. Nothing external needs to be modified. The correction is entirely positional. Thought must no longer be grounded in sense. It must recognize what underlies sense and hold what appears in relation to that. This is a simple shift, but it has total consequence. Because once thought is no longer confined to what appears, the entire structure opens. What is perceived remains exactly as it was. Forms do not disappear. Variation does not stop. Experience continues to unfold in the same way, but the way it is held changes completely. What appears is no longer treated as complete. It is recognized as dependent. It is understood as something that relies on what does not appear, rather than something that exists on its own. This restores the relationship that has been described throughout the earlier chapters. What changes is held in relation to what does not change. What appears is understood in relation to what allows it to appear. This is what removes distortion. Not by adding clarity, but by removing the assumption that what appears is sufficient. This shift does not require effort because it does not involve constructing anything. It does not unfold over time because it does not involve development. It is immediate because it is the removal of an incorrect position. But it does require recognition, because without recognition, the default position returns. And when it returns, the same structure forms again, and the same limitation becomes invisible again. This is why the correction is applied again here. Not because it was not understood, but because it was not held. And this is where precision becomes necessary, not in the explanation, in the position. The return to sense as foundation does not occur as a clear transition. It is not marked by a moment that can be easily identified. It develops gradually through small shifts that do not appear significant on their own. Thought does not abandon what has been established. It leans back into what is familiar. It begins to rely more heavily on what is visible, what is immediate, what is consistent within perception. This does not feel like a change in position. It feels like continuity. This is what makes it difficult to recognize. Because nothing seems to break. Understanding continues, interpretation continues. The system remains coherent, but it is operating within a narrower field. This is how drift stabilizes. Not through contradiction, but through repetition of the same alignment. Thought continues to ground itself in sense, and because sense continues to function, that alignment appears valid. This is why recognition must be continuous, not as effort and not as a task, but as awareness of position. When thought begins to treat what appears as sufficient, the shift has already begun. When what is visible becomes what is taken as real, the structure is narrowing again. When what does not appear is no longer held within understanding, it has already been excluded. Seeing this as it happens prevents it from stabilizing. Not by stopping it, but by recognizing that it does not hold in the same way once it is seen clearly. The assumption that what appears is sufficient loses its force when it is recognized as incomplete. This is what maintains the structure. Not control, not repetition, not effort, but clarity of position as it shifts. Because the conditions that produce the drift do not stop, recognition cannot stop either. Without it, the return to sense becomes complete again, and the underlying condition disappears from the structure of understanding. This is where everything is either held or lost, not in what is known, but in how it is held. This chapter does not extend the system. It does not introduce a new principle, and it does not add complexity to what has already been established. Everything remains exactly as it was. What has been addressed is the instability in how it is held. The distinction between mind and sense is not difficult to understand. It does not require deep analysis or extended reasoning, but it does require precision in position. And without that precision, the entire structure returns to appearance. When thought is grounded in sense, everything is interpreted within what appears. What is visible becomes what is treated as real. What is not visible becomes excluded. The system remains coherent, but it is incomplete. When thought remains aligned with what underlies sense, appearance is held correctly. It is recognized as dependent. It is understood in relation to what allows it to exist, and the structure remains intact. This is the entire movement of the chapter. Not expansion, correction, not development, stability. Because once this position is held consistently, nothing else is required. The system does not need further explanation. It does not need additional layers. It requires only that it is not replaced by what has already been shown to be incomplete. This is what the chapter leaves in place. Not something to build, something to not lose. Because what has been established does not change. Only the position from which it is held does. And that is the only thing that matters here. There is a point where what feels like loss is no longer experienced as loss, but as misinterpretation. Not because things stop changing, and not because what appears remains fixed, but because the way change is being understood has not yet been seen clearly enough to hold under pressure. This is chapter 16 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It does not introduce a new system, and it does not expand the structure in a new direction. Instead, it returns to something that seems obvious, almost too simple to question, but is consistently misunderstood at a structural level: the idea that things are destroyed. If you have been following this series properly, then everything required to understand this has already been established. What appears is not self-sufficient. What changes depends on what does not change. Thought cannot be grounded in sense if the structure is to remain intact. Mind is the condition that allows both perception and thought to occur. These are not new ideas, and this chapter does not attempt to restate them in a different way. So, before continuing, follow the channel and move back through the earlier chapters if needed, because this chapter depends entirely on that structure being held without distortion. Without that, what is being said here will sound like contradiction. With it, it becomes a direct continuation. What this chapter addresses is not change itself, but how change is interpreted. Because within perception, everything appears to come into being and pass away. Forms emerge, hold for a period, and then dissolve. Objects are created, altered, and removed. Events begin and end. This is what sense presents, and it presents it in a way that feels complete. And because it feels complete, it is trusted. This is where the problem begins. Because what sense presents is not the full structure of what is happening. It is only the visible portion of a process that depends on something that does not appear. And when that underlying condition is not included in understanding, what is seen is interpreted as total. This is where destruction is assumed. Something was present and now it is not. Something existed in a particular form and now that form is gone. This feels undeniable because it is directly observed. But everything that has already been established shows that this interpretation cannot hold. Because what appears does not exist independently. It does not arise from itself and it does not sustain itself. It depends on what underlies it. It depends on what does not come into being and what does not pass away. So if what appears changes, that change cannot involve destruction at the level of what is. It can only involve transformation at the level of appearance. This is the shift the chapter is making. Not by denying change, but by removing the idea that change involves loss of what is real. And that is where it begins. Destruction seems obvious because perception presents change as disappearance. What was once visible is no longer visible. What was once present in a particular configuration is no longer present in that configuration. This is immediate, and it is convincing. Sense does not track continuity beyond what appears. It registers form, and when that form is no longer present, it registers absence. This creates a pattern that appears complete in itself. Something appears, and then it disappears. Within this pattern, it seems unavoidable to conclude that something has been lost. This is reinforced by how thought operates when it is grounded in sense. Thought takes what is presented and builds meaning from it. It does not extend beyond it unless it has been correctly positioned. So when perception presents absence, thought interprets that absence as the removal of something that once existed. This interpretation becomes automatic because it aligns with everything that perception provides. There is no immediate contradiction. There is no failure in the system that forces a reconsideration. Everything appears to function correctly. This is why destruction seems not only possible, but obvious. But this conclusion depends entirely on one assumption, that what appears is self-sufficient. That form defines what something is. That the presence of a form is the presence of the thing itself, and the absence of that form is its absence. This assumption has already been shown to be incomplete, because form does not define what is, it expresses it. What appears is a configuration within a larger structure. It is not independent, it does not originate from itself, and it does not sustain itself. It is dependent on what underlies it. So when form changes, nothing at the level of what allows form is lost. Only the configuration shifts. Only the way in which what is appears changes. But because perception does not show this continuity, it suggests that something has been removed entirely. This is where the misunderstanding stabilizes. Not because something incorrect is being added, but because something essential is being left out. And because what is left out does not appear, it is not included in the structure of understanding. This is why destruction seems obvious. Not because it occurs at the level of what is, but because the level at which it does not occur is not being recognized. Once destruction is removed as an interpretation, change must be understood differently. Because what remains is not static continuity, but transformation. Transformation does not involve the creation of something from nothing, and it does not involve the disappearance of something into nothing. It is the reconfiguration of what already is within the field of appearance. This is consistent with everything that has already been established. What does not change underlies what does. What does not come into being allows what appears to come into being. So nothing that appears can exist independently of what remains constant. This means that when something changes form, it is not leaving existence. It is altering the way it appears. The underlying condition remains exactly as it was. This removes the idea of loss at the structural level. Because what is real does not depend on form. It does not depend on what appears. It is not subject to the conditions that govern change. So when change occurs, nothing real is destroyed. Only appearance shifts. This is not an abstract claim. It is a direct consequence of the structure that has already been described. If what appears is dependent, then its alteration cannot affect what allows it. But this is not how it is experienced when thought remains aligned with sense. Because perception presents contrast, not continuity. It shows difference between what was and what is. It does not show the underlying condition that allows both states to exist. So the mind fills in the gap with an assumption that what was has been lost, that what is now present has replaced it, and that something has been removed entirely. This is where interpretation must shift. Not by denying perception, but by placing it within a larger structure. Perception shows change. It does not define what is. Once this is held, transformation becomes the only coherent explanation. Nothing is created from nothing. Nothing is destroyed into nothing. Everything that appears moves within what already is, and that movement does not affect what is real. This is the correction being made, not to change, but to how change is understood. Even when this structure is understood, loss can still feel real, because the experience of change is immediate, and the interpretation of that change is deeply conditioned. When something no longer appears in the way it did before, the absence is felt directly. There is a contrast between what was present and what is now present. This contrast is interpreted as removal, and that interpretation carries weight. This is not because something has been destroyed, but because perception dominates the experience. Perception operates through presence and absence. It does not track continuity beyond appearance. It registers what is visible, and when that visibility changes, it presents that change as loss. Thought, when grounded in sense, reinforces this. It takes what is presented and builds meaning from it. It does not extend beyond it unless it has been positioned correctly. So when perception presents absence, thought interprets that absence as destruction. This interpretation becomes automatic. And because it is automatic, it feels true. This is why loss feels absolute. Not because something has been removed from what is, but because the level at which nothing is removed is not being held in the moment of interpretation. This is where the earlier correction must be applied again. Thought must not remain grounded in sense. It must recognize what underlies sense, even when perception presents change as loss. This does not remove the experience of change. It removes the misinterpretation of that experience. What is felt does not need to be denied. What must shift is what is assumed about it. Because once the assumption of destruction is removed, the experience of change no longer carries the same meaning. It is no longer loss. It is movement within appearance, and that movement does not affect what is real. This is where the structure stabilizes, not by removing experience, but by removing distortion. Holding this position requires continuity of recognition, because perception will continue to present change as loss, and thought will continue to interpret that change within the limits of sense if it is not corrected. This is not something that resolves once and remains resolved. It is ongoing. So the recognition must also be ongoing, not as effort, but as clarity. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that what changes depends on what does not. Clarity that disappearance within perception does not equal destruction at the level of what is. This clarity must be present in the moment change is experienced, not afterward, not as reflection, but as immediate recognition. Because once interpretation forms without it, the assumption of loss stabilizes again. This is where the earlier chapters connect directly. The same structure applies here. Thought must remain aligned with what underlies sense. If it does, change is seen as transformation. If it does not, change is interpreted as destruction. This is the only difference. Nothing else needs to be added. This is why the chapter does not expand beyond this point. Because once this is clear, everything that appears can be understood within it. Forms will continue to change. Appearance will continue to shift. But nothing real will be lost. And that must be held continuously. Because without that, the same misinterpretation returns. And with it, the same sense of loss. This chapter does not deny change. It does not attempt to remove the experience of transformation, and it does not suggest that what appears remains fixed. What it removes is the interpretation that change involves destruction. Because that interpretation cannot hold within the structure that has already been established. What appears is dependent. What underlies it does not change. So nothing at the level of what is can be destroyed. Only what appears can change. This is the entire movement of the chapter. Not expansion. Correction. Not complexity. Clarity. Because once this is understood, the experience of change is no longer interpreted as loss. It is seen as transformation. And that transformation does not affect what is real. This is what stabilizes the structure. Not by removing experience, but by removing the misinterpretation of experience. Nothing new is required beyond this, only that it is held. Because without that, the same assumption returns, and with it, the same distortion. Nothing is lost, only misunderstood. And that is where it ends. There is a point where the question is no longer what is true, but why what is not true continues to be held as though it were. Not because the distinction cannot be made, and not because truth is hidden, but because the structure that allows distortion has not been fully dismantled. This is chapter 17 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It does not introduce a new idea, and it does not move into a different area of the system. Instead, it turns directly towards something that has been present the entire time but has not yet been addressed in its most exposed form, the persistence of untruth. If you have been following this series properly, then everything required to understand this has already been established. You have seen that what appears is not self-sufficient. You have seen that thought, when grounded in sense, produces a closed structure. You have seen that mind is not divided, and that what underlies everything does not change. You have seen that rebirth is the removal of what was never correct. You have seen that nothing is destroyed, only transformed. So before continuing, follow the channel and return to the earlier chapters if needed, because this chapter depends entirely on that structure being held clearly. Without it, what is said here will feel abstract or confrontational without resolution. With it, it becomes direct. What this chapter addresses is not truth as a concept, but truth as position. Because truth is not something that is added to what is already being held. It is not something that is learned, collected, or constructed. It is what remains when what is false is no longer maintained. This is where the shift becomes uncomfortable. Because what is false is not held as false. It is held as real. It is integrated into perception, into thought, into identity, into the way everything is interpreted. It is not separate from understanding. It defines it. This is why truth feels difficult to stabilize. Not because it is complex, but because what is being removed is not something external. It is the way everything has been structured. This is where the chapter begins. Not by explaining truth, but by exposing what continues to stand in its place. And that is what has to be seen. Untruth does not appear false. This is what gives it stability. It does not present itself as distortion. It presents itself as understanding. Everything that has already been established points to this. When thought is grounded in sense, it produces a complete structure within appearance. It organizes what is perceived. It creates coherence. It explains relationships between forms. It builds systems that function. And because it functions, it is trusted. There is no immediate indication that something is missing. There is no clear contradiction that forces a reconsideration. Everything appears to be in place. Everything seems to make sense. This is what gives untruth its persistence. Because it does not feel like untruth. It feels like clarity. But this clarity is limited. Not because it is incorrect within its own field, but because it does not extend beyond that field. It does not include what underlies what appears. It does not account for what allows perception itself. So while it appears complete, it is structurally partial. This partial structure becomes the foundation for further understanding. Thought builds on it. Interpretation extends from it. Identity forms within it. And because everything is built within the same limitation, the limitation is never exposed. This is what makes untruth stable. Not because it is defended, but because it is never recognized. And because it is never recognized, it is never removed. This is why truth cannot simply be introduced. Because there is no space for it within a structure that already appears complete. Something has to be removed. And that removal is not comfortable. Because what is being removed is not experienced as false. It is experienced as what has always been. This is the difficulty. Not understanding truth, but releasing what has never been questioned. And that is what the chapter is moving into. Truth is not something that is added to understanding. It is not a new layer placed on top of what is already there. It is not a refinement or improvement of what is already being held. It is the removal of what is not true. This is what makes it difficult to approach through ordinary thinking, because thought operates by addition. It gathers, compares, builds, and extends. It assumes that clarity comes from accumulation. But truth does not function that way. It does not accumulate. It reveals. And what it reveals is not something new. It is what remains when distortion is no longer present. This is consistent with everything that has already been established. Rebirth is not becoming something new. It is the removal of what was never correct. Mind is not something that develops. It is what allows development to appear. Nothing is destroyed, only misinterpreted. All of these point to the same movement. Removal, not addition. But removal is not something thought naturally does, because what is being removed is not external. It is internal to the structure of understanding. It is how things are being held. This is why truth cannot be approached as knowledge. It cannot be learned in the same way as information, because information adds. Truth removes. This creates resistance. Because what is being removed feels necessary. It feels like the structure that allows understanding to function. So releasing it feels like losing clarity, even though what is actually being removed is distortion. This is the inversion the chapter is pointing to. What feels like clarity is limitation. What feels like loss is correction. And until that inversion is recognized, truth cannot stabilize. Because what replaces it continues to feel more real. This is what must be seen clearly. Truth is not something to gain. It is something that remains when what is false is no longer held. And that requires a different kind of recognition. Not accumulation, but removal. Truth feels unstable because it is not supported by the structures that normally create stability. It does not rely on repetition, reinforcement, or accumulation. It does not build in the way that thought builds. What gives it stability is the absence of distortion. But distortion is constantly being reintroduced. Perception continues to operate. Thought continues to organize what appears. Attention continues to move toward what is immediate. So unless what has been removed is recognized as it returns, it will be taken up again. This is why truth does not hold automatically. Not because it is weak, but because what replaces it is familiar. And familiarity feels stable. The structures built on untruth are consistent. They repeat. They reinforce themselves. They create patterns that can be relied on. Truth does not do this. It does not reinforce itself. It simply remains when distortion is not present. This makes it easy to lose, not because it disappears, but because something else takes its place. And that replacement does not feel like a replacement. It feels like continuity. This is why recognition must remain active, not as effort, but as clarity. Clarity of when distortion is returning. Clarity of when thought is grounding itself in sense again. Clarity of when what appears is being treated as complete. This is what stabilizes truth. Not holding on to it, but not replacing it. And that distinction has to remain clear. Because once it is lost, the structure rebuilds itself automatically, and truth is no longer recognized. This is the tension the chapter is exposing. Not the difficulty of truth, but the persistence of what replaces it. The key is not maintaining truth as a state. It is recognizing distortion as it forms. Because distortion does not appear fully formed. It begins as a shift in position. Thought begins to lean back into sense. What appears begins to feel more complete. What does not appear begins to fall out of consideration. This is subtle. And because it is subtle, it is rarely noticed at the point where it begins. Instead, it is recognized only once it has stabilized. At that point, it feels like something that has to be corrected, something that has to be undone. But by then, the structure has already formed. This is why recognition must move earlier, to the point where the shift begins. When thought starts to treat what appears as sufficient, when perception starts to define what is real, when what does not appear is no longer held within understanding. This is the moment. Seeing this as it happens prevents it from stabilizing, not by stopping it, but by removing its ability to hold. Because once it is seen clearly, it no longer feels complete. It no longer feels sufficient. And without that, it cannot replace truth. This is how truth remains. Not by being held, but by not being replaced. And that is a different kind of stability. Not built, recognized. This chapter does not define truth. It removes what is not true. Because truth does not need to be defined. It is what remains when distortion is no longer present. Everything that has been established leads to this point. Not as a conclusion, but as a condition. What appears is not self-sufficient. Thought must not be grounded in sense. Mind is not divided. Nothing is destroyed. Rebirth is the removal of what was never correct. All of this converges here. Truth is not something separate from these. It is what remains when they are held correctly. And what prevents it is not lack of understanding, but the persistence of distortion. This is what the chapter exposes. Not the difficulty of truth, but the ease with which it is replaced, and the fact that this replacement is rarely recognized. This is what must remain clear, not as an idea, but as position. Because once it is clear, nothing new is required, only that it is not replaced, and that is where it ends. There is a point where continuing to search becomes the final barrier. Not because searching is wrong, and not because understanding has no value, but because the structure that has been built is still being treated as something that leads somewhere else. This is where everything that has already been established can collapse again, not through contradiction, but through continuation. This is chapter 18 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It is not an expansion, and it is not a conclusion in the way most conclusions are understood. It does not introduce something new, and it does not resolve what came before by adding a final piece. Instead, it removes the last place where the entire structure can still be misunderstood, even after everything has been made clear. If you have followed this series properly, then you already have everything that is required. You have seen that what appears is not self-sufficient. You have seen that thought, when grounded in sense, creates a closed system that cannot reach what underlies it. You have seen that mind is not something that develops, but the condition that allows development to appear. You have seen that there is no division at that level. You have seen that rebirth is not something gained, but something revealed when what is false is no longer held. You have seen that nothing is destroyed, only transformed. And you have seen that truth is not something added, but something that remains when distortion is removed. All of this has already been established. So follow the channel and go back through those chapters if needed, because this one will not rebuild that structure. It will not walk through it again step by step. It assumes that it is already present and it speaks from within it. What this chapter addresses is not what is missing. It addresses the assumption that something is missing. Because as long as that assumption remains, everything that has already been seen can be reinterpreted incorrectly. As long as there is a sense that something still needs to be reached, something still needs to be understood, something still needs to be completed, then thought is still operating from within the same position that created the limitation in the first place. This is subtle, because it does not feel like error. It feels like commitment. It feels like depth. It feels like continuing to engage with something that matters. But it is still movement. And movement implies distance. And distance implies separation. And that separation has already been shown not to exist at the level that matters. This is the final inversion. Because everything within perception is structured around movement. You move from not knowing to knowing. You move from confusion to clarity. You move from one state to another. This is how everything functions within appearance, and it is so consistent that it is rarely questioned. So it is assumed that this applies here as well. That understanding develops. That truth is approached. That clarity increases. That eventually something final is reached. But this entire structure has already been dismantled. What is real does not develop. It does not become more of what it is. It does not move toward completion. It is already complete. So the idea that there is still something to reach is not just unnecessary. It is the final distortion, because it reintroduces movement where movement does not apply. It reintroduces distance where there is no distance. It reintroduces the idea that something is elsewhere when everything that has been established shows that it is not. This is where everything has to stop. Not in action, in assumption. The assumption that there is still something beyond what has already been seen. The assumption that understanding needs to continue in the same way. The assumption that truth is still ahead. Because as long as that remains, the structure is not being held correctly. And this is what the chapter removes, not by arguing against it, not by explaining it again, but by exposing it directly. Because once it is seen clearly, it cannot hold in the same way. This is where the system either stabilizes completely or begins to rebuild itself again, not based on what you know, but based on whether you are still moving. And that is what has to be seen. Once the structure has been laid out, and once the major distortions have been removed, there is still one movement that continues almost unnoticed. It does not appear as error. It does not present itself as misunderstanding. It presents itself as continuation. This is where the final distortion remains. Because even after everything has been made clear, there is still a tendency to believe that something is still unfolding. To form. That understanding is still progressing. That clarity is still deepening in the same way it always has. That there is still somewhere to move toward. This feels natural. Not because it is correct, but because it mirrors every other process within perception. Everything that is learned develops over time. Everything that is built requires progression. Everything that becomes clear does so gradually. So it is assumed that this follows the same pattern. That assumption is the problem, because everything that has already been established shows that this structure does not apply here. What is real does not develop. What underlies everything does not change. What allows thought and perception to occur is not something that becomes more of itself over time. So the idea that there is still something to reach is not neutral. It is not harmless. It reintroduces the entire structure that has already been dismantled. Because once there is something to reach, there is distance. Once there is distance, there is separation. Once there is separation, there is movement. And once there is movement, thought returns to operating within appearance again. This is how the entire system rebuilds itself, not through contradiction, but through continuation. This is why it is difficult to recognize, because nothing seems wrong. Everything seems aligned. Everything still refers back to what has already been established, but the position has shifted. And that shift changes everything. Because now what was understood as complete is being treated as incomplete. What was seen as already present is being treated as something to move toward. And once that happens, the structure is no longer being held. It is being used as a path. This is where the error stabilizes, because using the structure as a path feels correct. It feels like engagement. It feels like depth. It feels like taking it seriously. But it is still movement. And movement implies that what is being moved toward is not already here. This is the inversion that has to be seen. Not intellectually, directly. Because as long as this movement continues, everything else remains unstable. No matter how clearly everything else has been understood, it can still collapse back into the same pattern if this is not recognized. This is why the chapter does not expand on the structure. It removes this movement, not by forcing stillness, but by exposing the assumption that there is still something to reach. Because once that assumption is seen clearly, it does not hold. It cannot be maintained in the same way. And when it drops, everything that has already been established becomes stable in a way it was not before. Not because something new has been added, but because nothing is being projected beyond it. This is where seeking has to be understood correctly. Seeking is not wrong, but what is being sought determines whether it reinforces distortion or removes it. If what is being sought is something beyond what is already present, it reinforces the structure of separation. If what is being sought is the removal of what is false, it collapses that structure. This is the distinction. And once that distinction is no longer misapplied, the need to continue in the same way disappears. Not because there is nothing left, but because nothing is missing. This is the point where everything either stabilizes or resets. Not based on knowledge, but based on whether movement is still being maintained. And that is what has to be seen clearly. Because it is the last place the structure can be misunderstood while still appearing correct. Once the movement towards something stops being taken as necessary, what remains is not emptiness, and it is not a lack. It is not the absence of understanding, and it is not the loss of direction. What remains is completeness without extension. This is where the structure becomes difficult to hold, because everything within thought is organized around addition. Thought builds by accumulation. It moves from less to more. It assumes that clarity increases through expansion, that understanding grows through the addition of new elements, new distinctions, new perspectives. This is how everything functions within appearance. And because it functions, it is trusted. So when this system is applied here, it creates a subtle distortion. It assumes that what has been established is not yet complete. It assumes that there is still something more to include, something more to understand, something more to integrate. This assumption does not feel like error. It feels like depth. It feels like seriousness. It feels like continuing to engage with something that matters, but it is still based on the same structure. It still assumes that something is missing. And that assumption has already been shown not to hold, because what has been established is not partial. It is not incomplete. It does not require extension. Everything that defines the structure is already present. What appears is not self-sufficient. What underlies it does not change. Thought must not be grounded in sense. Truth is not something added. Nothing is destroyed. Rebirth is the removal of what was never correct. There is no division. These are not fragments. They are not parts of something larger that still needs to be assembled. They are the entire structure. So continuing to add to them does not strengthen them. It distorts them, because it reintroduces the idea that something is still missing. And once that idea is active, the structure begins to shift again. Not dramatically, quietly. It becomes something to work on, something to refine, something to deepen. And once that happens, it is no longer being held as complete. It is being treated as a process. This is the shift that has to be seen, because it does not feel like a shift. It feels like continuity. It feels like the same engagement that brought understanding in the first place. But it is not the same. Because earlier, what was being removed was distortion. Now, what is being added is unnecessary. And unnecessary addition is not neutral. It creates movement. And movement implies that what is being moved toward is not already here. This is where the entire structure becomes unstable again. Not because it is wrong, but because it is being misused. It is being treated as something that leads somewhere, rather than something that already is. This is why nothing further can be added. Not because there is a limit to what can be said, but because anything added at this point moves it away from what it is. It introduces direction. It introduces progression. It introduces the idea that something is still unfolding. And all of that contradicts what has already been made clear. This is why the chapter contracts. It removes the need for expansion. Not by arguing against it, but by exposing it. Because once it is seen that nothing further is required, the impulse to add loses its force. Not because it is resisted, but because it is no longer convincing. And once it is no longer convincing, it does not hold. This is where the structure stabilizes, not through reinforcement, but through absence of addition. This is the inversion. Because normally, stability comes from repetition, from reinforcement, from building something stronger over time. Here, stability comes from not adding anything at all, from leaving what is already complete exactly as it is. This is difficult to accept, because it feels like stopping, like losing momentum, like stepping away from something. But what is actually being removed is not depth. It is distortion, the assumption that more is required. Once that is gone, what remains is not less. It is clear, and that clarity does not depend on anything else. It does not need to be maintained. It does not need to be reinforced. It simply is. And the only thing that disrupts it is the attempt to add to it. This is why nothing further can be added. Not because there is nothing left, but because everything is already present. And anything beyond that is movement away from it. This is the point where everything either settles completely or begins to drift again. Not based on how much is known, but based on whether there is still an attempt to continue. And that is what has to be seen, because it is the last place where the structure can be misunderstood while still appearing correct. Even when it is seen that nothing further needs to be added, the movement to continue does not immediately stop. Not because it is necessary, and not because it is correct, but because it is embedded in the way thought operates. Thought is structured around movement. It does not remain still by default. It builds, compares, extends, and refines. It looks for patterns, and once those patterns are established, it looks for the next layer beyond them. This is not a flaw. It is how thought functions within appearance. It allows understanding to develop, systems to be created, and relationships to be recognized. And because it works so consistently, it becomes trusted. So even when the structure has been seen clearly, this movement does not disappear. It continues, not as error, but as habit. And because it is habit, it feels natural. It feels like the correct way to engage. It feels like what should happen next. This is why, even at this point, there is still a pull to keep going, to analyze further, to refine more, to explain again, to find a deeper layer. Not because something is missing, but because movement has not been recognized as unnecessary. This is where the distinction has to be made clearly. The movement of thought is not the same as the requirement for movement. Thought can continue, but that does not mean it should be followed. This is the inversion, because normally, thought leads. It defines direction. It determines what comes next. But here, that relationship has to shift. Thought is no longer the guide. It is simply something that occurs. And when it attempts to continue beyond what is required, it has to be seen for what it is. Not direction, not necessity, habit. This is what removes its authority, not by stopping it, but by not following it. Because the moment it is followed, it creates extension. It creates continuation. It creates the idea that something is still unfolding. And once that idea is active, the structure begins to move again. Not outwardly, internally. It becomes something that is being developed, something that is being deepened, something that is still in process. And that is where distortion returns, because process implies that what is being processed is not complete. And that has already been shown not to hold. This is why the mind continues, not because it is required, but because it has not been seen clearly enough to stop being followed. Once it is seen as habit, it loses its position as authority. It is no longer taken as direction. It is no longer mistaken for necessity. It becomes something that can occur without being engaged. And this is where the structure stabilizes, not by removing thought, but by removing its role as guide. This is subtle, because it does not feel like a change. Thought still occurs. Ideas still arise. Interpretation still moves. But the difference is that none of it is taken as something that needs to be followed further. This is where continuation ends. Not because movement stops, but because movement is no longer mistaken for progress. And that distinction is what holds everything in place, because without it, the same pattern repeats. Thought continues. It is followed. It extends the structure, and the entire system begins to move again. Not because it needs to, but because it has not been recognized as unnecessary. This is why this section is critical, because it addresses the final mechanism that keeps everything unstable. Not misunderstanding, not lack of knowledge, but the automatic continuation of thought beyond what is required. And once that is seen clearly, it cannot hold in the same way. It can still occur, but it does not direct. It does not lead. It does not extend. And without that, the structure remains exactly as it is, unchanged, complete, not because it has been finalized, but because it was never incomplete. This is the point where everything either stabilizes fully or begins to drift again, not based on what is known, but based on whether thought is still being followed when it moves unnecessarily. And that is what has to be seen clearly, because it is the last active mechanism that can reintroduce distortion without appearing to do so. Once it is clear that nothing further needs to be added, and once it is seen that the movement to continue is not required, what remains is not something that has to be held in place. It is not something that needs to be stabilized through effort, and it is not something that needs to be protected from change. What remains is what has always been there, without being altered. This is where the idea of remaining can be misunderstood, because remaining is often taken to mean maintaining, holding something in place, ensuring that it does not shift, repeating it, reinforcing it, keeping it active so that it does not disappear. But that is still movement. It is still effort. It is still based on the assumption that something can be lost. And that assumption has already been removed, because what has been established does not depend on conditions. It does not arise, and it does not pass away. It does not require support, and it cannot be weakened by absence of reinforcement. So remaining is not something that is done. It is what is left when nothing replaces it. This is a different kind of stability. Not the stability that comes from repetition or reinforcement, but the stability that comes from absence of interference. This is subtle because it does not feel like stability in the way stability is normally experienced. There is no sense of holding something together. There is no sense of maintaining clarity. There is no sense of actively keeping something in place. And because of that, it can feel incomplete. It can feel like something is missing, like something should be happening, like there should be some form of engagement that confirms it. But this is where the inversion has to be held. Because the feeling that something should be happening is the same movement that has already been shown to be unnecessary. It is the same pull toward continuation, the same assumption that more is required. So even here, that has to be seen. not resisted, seen. Because once it is seen clearly, it does not hold in the same way. It does not create the same pressure to act. It does not create the same sense of incompleteness. It becomes just another movement that does not need to be followed. This is how remaining stabilizes, not through action, but through the absence of replacing, because what replaces it is always the same. Movement, continuation. The idea that something needs to be done. The idea that something needs to be maintained. The idea that something needs to be reinforced. All of these are extensions of the same assumption, that what is present is not enough, and that assumption has already been removed. So remaining is not about holding on to what is present. It is about not reintroducing what has been removed. This is where the structure finally settles. Not because it has been completed, but because it is no longer being altered. And this is where the difference becomes clear between something that is maintained and something that remains. What is maintained depends on effort. What remains does not. What is maintained can be lost if effort stops. What remains cannot be lost because it is not dependent on effort. This is why nothing needs to be done to keep it. Because there is nothing that can remove it except the return of distortion. And distortion only returns when it is not recognized. So the only thing that matters here is clarity, not action, not reinforcement, not continuation, just clarity. Clarity that nothing needs to be added. Clarity that nothing needs to be held. Clarity that nothing is being lost. This is what allows it to remain. Not because it is being kept, but because nothing is interfering with it. And once this is clear, the idea of doing something with it disappears, because there is nothing to do, only something to not replace. And that is what holds everything in place without effort. This is the final settling point, not because it is reached, but because nothing is moving away from it anymore. And that is what defines remaining, not activity, absence of unnecessary movement. Nothing new is being concluded here because nothing has been moving toward a conclusion. What has been established across all of these chapters has not been building toward an end point, and it has not been progressing towards something final that arrives only at the end. Everything that has been established was already complete at the moment it was seen clearly. What has changed across the movement of the text is not the structure itself, but the removal of what prevented it from being held. Each chapter has not added something new in the way knowledge is normally added. It has removed something that was distorting what was already present. This is why this final section does not summarize in the way a summary would normally function. It does not gather everything together and present it again in a simplified form. It does not attempt to reinforce the structure by repeating it as a system, because all of that would imply that something needs to be retained, maintained, or remembered in a particular way. And that would reintroduce effort. It would reintroduce the idea that something has to be done with what has been seen. That something has to be carried forward. That something has to be applied. But none of that is required, because what has been established does not depend on memory. It does not depend on repetition. It does not depend on reinforcement. It does not depend on application. It is not something that exists within the same structure as knowledge. It is what allows knowledge to appear. This is the distinction that has to remain clear, because once it is blurred, everything returns to the same pattern again. The pattern of accumulation, the pattern of development, the pattern of movement towards something. And that is not where this operates. This is why nothing needs to be concluded, because there is nothing to conclude. Nothing has been incomplete. Nothing has been waiting to be finished. Nothing has been building toward this moment. What has been happening is the removal of distortion. And once distortion is removed, nothing remains to be done. This is where the idea of ending has to be understood differently. Because normally an ending provides closure. It resolves something that was open. It completes something that was in process. But here there is nothing to resolve. There is nothing that remains open. There is nothing that has been left unfinished. So the ending is not a resolution. It is a cessation, not of the structure, but of the movement around it. The movement that treats it as something that needs to be continued, something that needs to be developed, something that needs to be carried forward. All of that stops here. Not because it is forced to stop, but because it is no longer necessary. And once it is no longer necessary, it cannot hold in the same way. This is what defines the final integration. Not bringing everything together, but leaving everything as it already is, without adding to it, without taking from it, without adjusting it, without continuing it. This is where the entire system either stabilizes completely or begins again. Not because something changes, but because the position from which it is held either remains clear or begins to shift. If it remains clear, nothing else is required. Everything that has been established continues without interruption. Not as something that is maintained, but as something that is not replaced. If it shifts, the same patterns return. Not because they are reintroduced deliberately, but because they were never fully removed. This is why this final section does not instruct. It does not guide. It does not tell you what to do next. Because there is no next. There is no further step. There is no continuation required. There is only whether what has already been seen is held without distortion. And that is not something that can be instructed. It can only be recognized. This is why everything ends here without direction. Because direction would imply movement. And movement would imply distance. And distance has already been shown not to exist at the level that matters. So nothing is being pointed toward. Nothing is being suggested. Nothing is being added. Everything remains exactly as it is. And the only thing that determines whether it holds is whether it is replaced. This is the final position. Not something to reach. Not something to maintain. Something to not move away from. Because once movement stops, what remains is what has always been present. Unchanged. Unaffected. Complete. And that is where it ends.